In 2011, 3 FBI agents were sent to investigate a series of disappearances along the Texas-Louisiana border near the Sabine National Forest. What we found wasn't human traffickers or drug cartels. It was something that moved on 2 legs, hunted in coordinated packs, and left evidence that the Bureau buried in classified files marked unexplained wildlife encounters. I was one of those agents. For 12 years, I've kept silent about what happened in those woods. Not anymore. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 18 years with the FBI before I took early retirement in 2023. Most of that time was with the Violent Crimes Against Children Unit, working cases that would turn your stomach. I've seen the worst of what humans can do to each other. I thought I understood the nature of predators. I was wrong. What we encountered in East Texas that autumn redefined everything I knew about threat assessment and survival. The assignment came through normal channels. Special Agent in Charge Morrison called me into his office on a Monday morning in late September. He had my partner, Agent Sarah Chen, already waiting. Morrison was old school bureau, 30 years in, with a face that looked carved from granite and eyes that had seen too many crime scenes to register shock anymore. But when he briefed us on the East Texas situation, I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression: uncertainty. 7 people had vanished over a 6-month period in a roughly 20-mile radius centered on the small town of Hemp Hill, Texas, population 2,000. The disappearances followed a pattern that made local law enforcement nervous. All 7 were experienced outdoorsmen, hunters, fishermen, people who knew the woods. All vanished during daylight hours. All left behind vehicles, weapons, and personal belongings at their last known locations. No bodies, no blood trails, no ransom demands. Just empty campsites and abandoned trucks with the keys still in the ignition. The local sheriff, a man named Pruitt, had reached out to the Texas Rangers first. The Rangers had sent 2 investigators who spent 3 weeks combing the forest and interviewing locals. Their report raised more questions than it answered. They documented unusual track impressions, disturbed campsites with signs of struggle, and multiple witness accounts of large wolves moving through the area on their hind legs. The Rangers concluded their report by recommending federal involvement and suggesting specialized wildlife consultation. That's bureaucratic code for we're out of our depth and don't want our names on what comes next. The Bureau assigned a 3rd agent to our team, a specialist from the Behavioral Analysis Unit named Dr. James Reeves. Reeves was in his 40s, soft-spoken with advanced degrees in forensic psychology and criminology. He'd worked the Unabomber case early in his career and had a reputation for connecting dots that others missed. He brought with him a laptop full of reports I'd never seen before. Cases from FBI files going back 40 years. Strange attacks in wilderness areas, unusual predation patterns, encounters with unknown large mammals that defied zoological classification. We flew into Houston on October 3rd and drove 4 hours northeast to Hemp Hill. The town sat at the edge of the Sabine National Forest, a vast expanse of pine and hardwood stretching across the Texas-Louisiana border. The forest covered over 160,000 acres, dense enough to hide anything that wanted to stay hidden. As we drove through town, I noticed something wrong. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. Kids should have been walking home from school. People should have been out running errands. But the streets were empty. Every house had its curtains drawn. The few people we did see hurried from their cars to their doors without lingering outside. Sheriff Pruitt met us at his office, a small brick building on Main Street with a flag at half-mast. He was 62, weathered and lean, with 38 years in law enforcement. He'd been sheriff of Sabine County for 16 years and knew every family, every dirt road, every hunting blind in his jurisdiction. When we sat down in his office, he pulled out a map covered in red pins and started briefing us without preamble. Each pin represented a disappearance. The pattern formed a rough arc along the forest's western edge. "I've lived here my whole life," Pruitt said, his voice carrying a weight that came from watching his community come apart. "My father was sheriff before me. My grandfather hunted these woods when they were still called the East Texas Timber Belt. I've tracked bear, dealt with poachers, handled every kind of wildlife situation you can imagine. This isn't wildlife. This is something else." He paused and looked at each of us in turn. "People here are scared. Not worried, not concerned. Scared. Families are keeping their kids inside after dark. Hunters are staying out of the forest. We've had 3 businesses close because tourists stopped coming through. Whatever's out there, it's smart enough to avoid cameras, disciplined enough to leave no useful evidence, and strong enough to take down grown men without a sound." That evening, Pruitt took us to meet the last person who'd seen one of the victims alive. Her name was Linda Greer, 54, who ran a bait shop on the highway. Her husband Roy had been the 4th disappearance, back in July. She'd driven him to his favorite fishing spot at Toledo Bend Reservoir at dawn. When she came back to pick him up that evening, she found his truck, his tackle box, and his cell phone on the bank. His fishing rod was in the water, line still cast. The cooler he'd brought for his catch was open and empty. There were tracks in the mud around his setup, but they weren't human. Linda sat at her kitchen table with a coffee mug she never drank from and told us about the last 3 months, about how the forest had gone quiet in the weeks before Roy vanished, how the nightbirds stopped calling, how her dogs, which usually barked at every passing car, had started whining at night and refused to go outside after dark, how she'd heard something moving through her property 2 nights after Roy disappeared, something that walked on 2 legs based on the sound of its footfalls, heavy and deliberate. "I know what you're thinking," she said, looking directly at me. "Grieving widow, imagination running wild, seeing things that aren't there. But I'm not the only one. Talk to the Hendersons down the road. Talk to the Morales family. Talk to anyone who lives within 5 miles of the forest edge. We're all hearing the same things, seeing the same shadows, finding the same tracks. And before you tell me it's coyotes or feral dogs, I've lived in the country for 30 years. I know what dogs sound like. These things don't sound like anything I've ever heard." That night, back at the motel, Reeves opened his laptop and showed us what he'd been compiling. Reports from Montana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Sightings of large bipedal canines, usually 7 to 8 feet tall, with wolf-like features but walking upright. The reports went back decades, but there was a pattern Reeves had identified. The sightings clustered around certain geographic areas and seemed to increase during specific times of year, particularly autumn. More significantly, in areas with sustained sightings, there were almost always corresponding missing persons cases that remained unsolved. "The Bureau doesn't officially acknowledge these," Reeves said, his screen casting blue light across his face. "But internally there's a designation, Unknown Cryptid Encounters, or UCEs. We've been collecting data for 40 years, cross-referencing with fish and wildlife, comparing notes with similar cases in Canada and Northern Europe. The working theory is that we're dealing with an undocumented large predator, possibly a surviving population of something thought extinct, possibly something that successfully avoided scientific classification by maintaining small numbers and avoiding human contact." Chen, who'd been quiet during the briefing, spoke up. "You're telling me the FBI believes in dogmen?" She didn't sound skeptical, just careful. Chen was methodical, analytical, someone who built cases on evidence and testimony, not speculation. Reeves shook his head. "I'm telling you the FBI has documentation of encounters with large bipedal predators that don't match any known species. What the witnesses call them is irrelevant. What matters is the pattern. These things hunt in packs. They coordinate, they use tactics, and based on the East Texas timeline, they're escalating." The next morning we went into the forest. Pruitt and 2 of his deputies accompanied us, along with a local tracker named Ray Boone, who'd worked as a hunting guide for 25 years. We started at the site of the most recent disappearance, a man named Michael Torres who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier. Torres had been bow hunting from a tree stand on private property. The landowner found the stand empty, Torres's bow still hanging from its hook, his backpack and cell phone on the platform. There was blood on the stand's ladder, not much, but enough for a DNA match. It was Torres's blood. Boone found the tracks within 20 minutes. They were in soft earth near a creek bed, roughly 200 yards from the tree stand. The prints were canine in structure, but massive, 16 inches long with clear impressions of pads and claws. But these weren't the tracks of a quadruped. The stride pattern was wrong. The prints were oriented toe forward with the longer axis parallel to the direction of travel, the way a human foot prints when walking. The spacing between prints suggested something with a stride of 4 to 5 feet, much longer than any human could achieve naturally. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies whispered, staring down at the tracks. Boone knelt beside them and placed his hand next to a print for scale. His hand looked like a child's hand next to the impression. "These are fresh," he said. "Maybe 2 days old at most, and there's more than one." He pointed to overlapping tracks indicating at least 3 different individuals. The stride pattern was identical across all 3, suggesting they moved in formation, maintaining spacing. We followed the tracks for nearly a mile. They led deeper into the forest, following game trails and creek beds, avoiding open areas. The pattern showed clear intention. This wasn't the wandering path of animals foraging or exploring. This was a hunting route, efficient and purposeful. The tracks eventually converged with several other sets near a dense thicket of pines. In the center of that convergence, we found what was left of a deer carcass. The kill was recent, maybe 36 hours, but the way it had been taken apart wasn't natural. Most predators leave identifiable feeding patterns. Wolves feed on the hindquarters first. Bears tear and scatter remains. Mountain lions cache their kills. This deer had been methodically dismembered. The hide was removed in large sections and laid to the side. The meat had been stripped from the bones with precision. The long bones of the legs were cracked open to access the marrow, but they weren't chewed or gnawed. They were broken with leverage and tool use, or something approximating it. Chen took photographs while I sketched the scene. None of us spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't animal behavior, this was something else. We made camp that night in a clearing that Boone assured us was defensible. He and the deputies built a large fire and kept it stoked high. Pruitt produced a bottle of bourbon and we passed it around, not drinking heavily but just enough to take the edge off the tension. Around midnight the forest went silent, not gradually but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. The night insects stopped. The owls stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that silence we heard them. The sound started low, a vocalization that was part howl, part something else, deep and resonant, with a complexity that suggested deliberate communication rather than simple animal calls. It came from the northwest, maybe half a mile away. Then another answered from the east. Then another from the south. They were calling to each other, coordinating. Chen grabbed the digital recorder we'd brought and captured the sounds. When she played them back, they were even more unsettling than hearing them in real time. There were patterns in the vocalizations, rhythms that suggested language or at least structured communication. "How many?" I asked Boone. He was standing with his rifle across his chest, scanning the tree line. "At least 5, he said. "Maybe more. They're setting a perimeter." One of the deputies, a young man named Garcia who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at Pruitt. "Sheriff, should we call for backup?" Pruitt shook his head. "And tell them what? That we're hearing wolves? Nobody's coming out here for that. We stay alert, keep the fire high, and wait for dawn." Around 2 in the morning, something moved at the edge of our firelight. Just a shadow, but large and upright. Chen saw it too and grabbed her flashlight. When she pointed it into the darkness, the beam caught a reflection. 2 eyes, amber yellow and set high off the ground, maybe 7 feet up. The eyes held for a moment, then blinked and vanished, but not before I saw the silhouette. It was massive, broad-shouldered, with a head shape that was distinctly canine, but positioned on a neck that rose from a humanoid torso. Garcia raised his rifle. "Hold fire!" Pruitt snapped. "You don't know what you're shooting at in these conditions. You're as likely to hit a tree as anything else." Garcia lowered the rifle but kept it ready. We all stood there, facing outward, watching the darkness beyond the firelight. For the next hour, we heard movement in multiple directions, branches breaking, heavy footfalls, the sounds of large bodies moving through undergrowth, but nothing came closer than the edge of our light. It felt like assessment, like they were evaluating us, measuring us, Dawn came with agonizing slowness. When there was finally enough light to see clearly, we found tracks everywhere around our camp. They'd circled us multiple times during the night, approaching within 20 feet, but never crossing into the firelight. There were at least 6 different sets of prints, maybe more where they overlapped. The largest measured 19 inches long. Reeves examined the tracks with the systematic attention of a crime scene investigator, taking measurements, photographs, soil samples. His hands shook slightly as he worked. "They were testing us," he said quietly, "checking our response, our weapons, our numbers. This is reconnaissance behavior, the kind of tactical assessment you'd expect from an intelligent adversary, not an animal." Chen looked at him. "What are you saying?" Reeves stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. "I'm saying we need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with a predator that has cognitive capabilities significantly beyond what we'd expect from any known species. Pack coordination, tactical awareness, deliberate avoidance of threats. If the disappearances are connected to these tracks, and I believe they are, then we're looking at creatures that hunt humans methodically and successfully." We returned to town and spent the afternoon reviewing everything we'd documented. The tracks, the vocalizations, the deer carcass, the pattern of the disappearances. Reeves pulled up satellite imagery of the forest and marked every site where we'd found evidence. The map showed a clear territory, roughly 30 square miles, with the highest concentration of activity in a valley near the Louisiana border. That valley was isolated, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. It was the perfect habitat for something that wanted to avoid human contact. The next day we went into that valley. Pruitt had requisitioned night vision equipment and body cameras from the state police. If we were going to confront whatever was out there, we needed documentation that would hold up under scrutiny. The valley was dense with undergrowth and fallen timber, making movement slow and difficult. Boone led us along an old fire road that had been reclaimed by the forest. 3 miles in, we found the den site. It was in a limestone outcropping, a series of shallow caves and overhangs that formed natural shelter. The ground around the entrance was packed hard from use, worn smooth by years of traffic. The smell hit us from 50 feet away. Decomposition, animal musk, and something else. Something sharp and organic that I couldn't identify. Inside the main cave we found bones. Human bones, along with the remains of deer, wild boar, and various smaller animals. The human remains were from at least 4 individuals based on the skull fragments we could identify. They'd been stripped clean and broken open for marrow. Chen was documenting everything with her camera when Garcia called out from deeper in the cave system. We found him standing in a chamber that opened off the main cave. On the walls were marks, deliberate scratches arranged in patterns. Not random claw marks, but intentional inscriptions. Vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, hundreds of them. Counting marks, or something like them. In one corner was a collection of objects that looked like trophies. Watches, wallets, keys, jewelry, personal effects from the missing. "We need to leave," Boone said, his voice urgent. "Right now." I looked at him. His face had gone pale, his eyes scanning the cave entrance. "They're coming back. I can smell them." I didn't question him. We'd been there nearly 40 minutes, more than enough time for our scent to spread through the valley. If they were out hunting, they'd know their den had been invaded. We moved fast, faster than safety recommended, following Boone back toward the fire road. We heard them before we saw them. The howls started from multiple directions, closer than they'd been the night before. These weren't the distant calls of the previous evening. These were immediate, aggressive, territorial. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement, gray-brown shapes moving parallel to our position. They were following us, pacing us. Pruitt had his radio out, calling for backup, but we were too deep in the valley for good reception. Static and broken words were all that came back. The first one stepped onto the road ahead of us, and we all stopped. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall when fully upright, though it was slightly hunched forward in a posture that suggested it could drop to all fours if needed. The body was covered in dark gray-brown fur, thick and coarse. The head was distinctly wolf-like, with a pronounced muzzle and ears that stood erect and alert. But the eyes were wrong for a wolf. They were too forward-facing, too aware, holding an intelligence that looked through you rather than at you. It stood there, blocking the road, and made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, a rumbling that I felt in my chest. Behind us, 2 more emerged from the trees. To our left, another. To our right, 2 more. 6 in total, surrounding us in a coordinated formation that left no doubt about their intention. Garcia raised his rifle, but Pruitt grabbed the barrel and pushed it down. "Don't," he said quietly. "You fire. We all die. They're giving us a chance to leave." The one on the road took a step forward, then another. It was close enough now that I could see details. The hands, if they could be called that, had 5 digits with thick claws. But the thumb was semi-opposable. The musculature was incredible. Shoulders and chest like a heavyweight boxer, arms thick as my thighs. It stopped 10 feet away and made that sound again. Then it turned its head and looked directly at each of us in turn, as if memorizing our faces. The message was clear. We'd been warned. We backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact but not challenging. The creatures held their positions, letting us retreat. When we'd put 100 yards between us and them, they melted back into the forest without a sound. We didn't stop moving until we reached the vehicles. Only when we were inside with the doors locked did anyone speak. Garcia was shaking so hard he couldn't hold his rifle steady. Chen was pale, her hands gripping her camera like it was the only solid thing in the world. Reeves just stared through the windshield, his analytical mind trying to process what couldn't be processed. Back in town, we filed our reports, detailed, factual, documented with photographs, recordings, and physical evidence. We recommended immediate action, a coordinated response involving federal wildlife agencies, possibly military support given the threat level. Morrison read our reports, looked at our evidence, and made a phone call. An hour later, he called us back into his office. The case was being transferred to a specialized unit. Our investigation was concluded. All evidence was to be turned over immediately. Our reports would be classified. "You're telling us to walk away?" Chen said, her voice tight with frustration. Morrison looked at her with something like sympathy. "I'm telling you that this is above our pay grade. There are protocols for situations like this. Protocols that existed long before any of us joined the Bureau. Your job was to investigate and report. You did that. What happens next isn't our decision." He paused and met each of our eyes. "And if anyone asks, you were investigating a human trafficking ring that went cold. That's the official story. Understood?" 2 days later, a team arrived in Hemphill. They weren't FBI, or if they were, they weren't from any division I recognized. They wore civilian clothes, drove unmarked vehicles, and spoke to no one locally. They went into the forest in force, 20 men with equipment I'd never seen in Bureau inventory. They were there for a week. When they left, the disappearances stopped. The forest went quiet. Whatever had been out there was either gone or had learned to stay hidden. Reeves left the Bureau 6 months later. He took a teaching position at a university in Colorado, far from any significant forests. Chen transferred to white-collar crime, told me she wanted to deal with criminals she could understand. I stayed for another 12 years, but I never took another assignment that involved wilderness areas. The official files list 7 missing persons in Sabine County. Cause unknown. Case suspended pending new evidence. The classified files tell a different story, one that includes my reports, my photographs, and my testimony about what we encountered. But here's what the files don't tell you. The disappearances didn't stop in Hemphill. They slowed, they became more careful, but they continued. 1 or 2 a year in that region, spread out enough that they don't make patterns, don't draw attention. And it's not just East Texas. I've followed the reports since I left the Bureau. Michigan's Upper Peninsula, northern Wisconsin, rural Pennsylvania, Oregon, Washington. Anywhere there's deep forest and low population density, there are disappearances that fit the pattern. People who know the woods, who wouldn't get lost, who wouldn't just wander off, gone without a trace. The question I get asked most often is what I think they are: surviving dire wolves, some kind of convergent evolution, a species that successfully avoided scientific discovery by maintaining impossibly small populations. I don't know. What I do know is that they're intelligent, they coordinate, they use tactics, and they've learned to coexist with humans by staying in the shadows and taking only what they can take without drawing too much attention. They're apex predators that hunt the ultimate game, and they're very, very good at it. The second most common question is why I'm coming forward now. 2 reasons. First, because the people living in those border regions deserve to know what they're dealing with. The official silence serves the government's interests, not public safety. Second, because the encounters are increasing. Climate change is pushing wildlife into new territories. Human development is encroaching on previously isolated habitats. The buffer zones that kept these things separated from us are shrinking. What happened in Hemp Hill is going to happen again, and it's going to happen more frequently. I know what the skeptics will say. I'm making this up for attention, or I misidentified known animals, or I'm suffering from some kind of trauma-induced delusion. That's fine. I expected that. What I can't accept is staying silent while people continue to disappear, while communities live in fear, while the government maintains a policy of denial and classification. I took an oath to protect and serve. That oath didn't expire when I left the Bureau. If you're reading this and you live near large forested areas, particularly in the regions I mentioned, take precautions. Don't go into the woods alone. Travel in groups, make noise, carry weapons. Respect the forest's rules, and understand that you're not at the top of the food chain out there. If you see tracks that don't make sense, if you hear vocalizations that sound wrong, if your dogs refuse to go outside at night, trust your instincts. Leave the area. Report what you saw, even if you think no one will believe you. And if you're someone in a position of authority, someone who has access to the classified files, someone who knows the truth but has chosen silence over action, I'm asking you to reconsider. The policy of containment through secrecy isn't working. It never worked. The disappearances continue, the encounters continue, the attacks continue. At some point, there's going to be an incident too large to classify away, too public to explain as missing hikers or animal attacks. When that happens, the decades of denial are going to make the response exponentially harder. I've given this testimony knowing the consequences. I violated my security clearance, broken federal law regarding the disclosure of classified information, and likely ended any chance of working in law enforcement or government again. The Bureau will deny everything I've said. They'll produce my psychiatric evaluations, point to the stress of the cases I worked, suggest that I'm unreliable. That's their playbook, and I expected it. What they can't do is explain away the evidence, the photographs, the recordings, the testimony of multiple trained observers. Before I finish, I want to address the families of the missing. I know some of you watch these videos, looking for answers, hoping for closure. I'm sorry I can't give you better news. I'm sorry that the official investigations failed you. I'm sorry that your loved ones disappeared into those woods and never came home. What I can tell you is that they didn't suffer long. These creatures are efficient predators. They kill quickly. That's cold comfort, I know, but it's the truth. And I can tell you that your family members were brave, that they faced something beyond normal human experience, and that their stories deserve to be told. The encounter in Hemp Hill changed me fundamentally. Before that assignment, I believed the world was knowable, that science and investigation could explain everything, that the unknown was simply the not yet discovered. I don't believe that anymore. There are things in the deep places that we don't understand, that we've never understood, that have coexisted with us since before we had cities and agriculture and civilization. They were here first, and they've never really left. We just convinced ourselves they were gone because we couldn't see them anymore. When I close my eyes, I still see that creature standing on the fire road, 8 feet of muscle and fur and predatory intelligence, looking at me with eyes that understood exactly what I was and exactly how easily I could be killed. I see it in my dreams. I see it when I look at forests now, even the small city parks near my home. I know it's out there. I know its pack is out there. And I know that the only reason I'm alive to tell this story is because they chose to let me live, chose to send a message instead of eliminating witnesses, That's what haunts me most. Not that we encountered something unknown, but that it encountered us and made a calculated decision. It weighed the costs and benefits of killing 3 FBI agents, a sheriff, 2 deputies, and a guide. It ran the numbers on the response that would follow, the investigation, the scrutiny, and it decided we weren't worth the attention our deaths would bring. We were spared not by luck or skill, but by cold, predatory calculus. We weren't important enough to kill. I'm 61 years old now. I took early retirement, moved to a small city in the Midwest, far from any significant wilderness. I have a quiet life, a small house, a few friends who don't ask too many questions about my past. But I can't forget. Every time there's a news story about a missing hiker, every time I see a report about unexplained disappearances in rural areas, I wonder if it's happening again. I wonder if another family is about to lose someone. And I wonder if anyone is investigating with the truth in mind, or if they're following the official script of tragic accidents and unfortunate misadventures. The truth is out there, in classified files and sealed reports, in the memories of agents who've been told to forget what they saw, in the stories of witnesses who've been dismissed as unreliable. The truth is in the forest, in the tracks that appear after heavy rain, in the vocalizations that echo through the valleys at night, in the territories marked by disappearances that no one wants to acknowledge as patterns. The truth is that we share this continent with something that doesn't want to be known, doesn't need to be known, and has successfully remained hidden despite our satellites and our science and our certainty that we've conquered every mystery. Some people will read this and think I'm crazy. Some will think I'm seeking attention or trying to profit from tragedy. Some will have their own theories, their own explanations that let them sleep at night. That's human nature. We're uncomfortable with genuine mystery, with the idea that there are things we can't control or understand. But for those who've seen what I've seen, who've stood in the forest at night and felt that primal fear that comes from being prey, who've looked into eyes that reflected firelight with an intelligence that shouldn't exist, you know I'm telling the truth. You know because you've lived it. I can't give you complete answers. I don't know where they came from, or how many there are, or what their full capabilities might be. I don't know if they're the last remnants of an ancient species, or something that evolved in parallel with us, or something else entirely. What I know is limited to what I experienced and what I documented. But that experience was real. Those documents exist in classified archives, and the threat remains active. That's enough. That has to be enough. If you take nothing else from this, take this. Respect the wilderness. Understand that when you enter the forest, you're entering territory that belongs to something other than you. Travel prepared, travel aware, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the forest goes quiet, if you see tracks that don't make sense, leave immediately. Don't investigate. Don't try to document it. Don't convince yourself it's nothing. Get out and get to safety. Your life is worth more than your curiosity. And to those in power who continue the policy of secrecy and denial, I say this: history will judge you harshly. Every person who disappears while you maintain this silence, every family destroyed by unexplained loss, every community living in fear because you won't acknowledge the truth, that's on you. The time for secrecy ended when these things started hunting humans as primary prey. What started as isolated incidents in remote wilderness has become a pattern that threatens communities. Pretending it's not happening doesn't make it stop. It just makes the eventual reckoning worse. I've said what I needed to say. I've broken the silence that's been eating at me for 12 years. Whatever consequences come from this, I'll face them. I took an oath to protect and serve, and that meant something to me then, and it means something to me now. If speaking out protects even one person, if it saves even one family from the devastation of unexplained loss, then it was worth it. The truth matters. The people who disappeared in those forests matter. Their families matter. And the threat that remains active in our wilderness areas matters. This is my testimony, given freely and under oath if anyone wants to take it officially. I'm Marcus Webb, former Special Agent FBI, For 18 years I served with honor. I investigated crimes, built cases, put dangerous people away. And for 1 week in October 2011, I confronted something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I've carried that knowledge alone for too long. Now you carry it with me. Now you know what I know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.